Shalom everybody and greetings VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this video. It's been another amazing week here in Israel as we approach the festival of Hanukkah and the holiday of Christmas and the New Year according to the Gregorian calendar and a bunch of other stuff on other calendars such as the Julian calendar. Well anyhow, this says Hanukkah Sameach, Happy Hanukkah. But even as we approach a new year, we're still dealing with a bunch of old problems, including the war in Gaza, which is at a much lower tempo this week, but it's definitely still not over. We're also seeing growing signs of renewed hostilities against Hezbollah and possibly even Iran, which is suffering terrible economic and environmental problems, but is still determined to rebuild its ballistic missile arsenal so it can threaten Israel. Meanwhile, the Israeli government passed a budget for 2026 with large increases for the defense budget and cuts to almost everything else. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Well, friends, I always like to end these reports with some good news, and I'm going to continue that tradition this week. But I'm also going to start this week's report with some good news. So here it is. Hanukkah is upon us, and Christmas is coming right behind it. Hanukkah starts this year on the evening of Sunday, the 14th of December on the Gregorian calendar. Of course, it's the 25th of Kislev on the Hebrew calendar. And on that evening, we'll light the first candle of the menorah, and every subsequent night will light another candle for 8 nights. There's a long history and lots of traditions behind this festival, and I dove deep into all that in my weekly report that I did on prophetic convergence, which I invite you all to watch on social media at the Rumble site under Prophetic Convergence. Of course, later in the month, it will be time for Western Christians to celebrate Christmas, and then on to January 7th, it'll be time for Eastern Orthodox Christians to celebrate Christmas. One man on our staff grew up in the United States and married a woman from Russia, so their kids get to celebrate Thanksgiving, then Hanukkah, then both Western and Eastern Christmas. For those kids, it truly is the most wonderful time of the year, as the song goes. For many other children, it's also a wonderful time, and we sure do need some happy times in Israel because we've been through a rough couple of years and it's not over yet. In the Gaza Strip, we still have one last hostage, Sergeant Ron Gavili, who fell while defending southern Israel on October 7, 2023, and his dead body was kidnapped into Gaza. His mortal remains are still somewhere in Gaza, and Hamas says they're searching for him, but it's unclear if we should believe that. In any case, if and when he is returned, it will mark the end of a long national nightmare for us here. And even before that happens, pressure is already coming from Arab states and even from the West to move to Phase B of the Gaza ceasefire plan. Now, I need to explain something about that because there's been a lot of talk about it over the last few months and almost no one is being completely honest. Phase A of President Trump's plan for a ceasefire in Gaza included the immediate release of all the living hostages, and the plan was for the remains of all the hostages who were murdered in captivity to be handed over to Israel via the Red Cross within 72 hours of the truce beginning at noon on the 10th of October. Well, that 72 hours had now been stretched out to nearly 2 months, and as I said, the remains of Ron Gavili have not yet been accounted for. However, other elements of Phase A have been completed. The IDF has withdrawn to what's called the Yellow Line, which bisects the Strip from north to south and includes about 53% of the Strip's territory, mostly the open areas outside the coastal cities. The other side of the Yellow Line contains most of the urban areas and nearly all of the Palestinian population. The IDF also kept control of most of the southern city of Rafiah, known as Rafah, which sits on the border with Egypt. It was through those tunnels dug underneath that border that most of the weapons, ammunition, narcotics, and other contraband that Hamas used to carry out its attacks against Israel came through. That is why the IDF has stayed put on that border, which is also called the Philadelphia corridor, not to be confused with Philadelphia cream cheese. Now please, Phase B of the ceasefire plan is set to include things that both Israel and Hamas are not eager for. Hamas is supposed to disarm, and the IDF is supposed to pull back even further east away from the yellow line. Hamas has said over and over again that it has no intention of disarming, although that's part of what they agreed to when this ceasefire began. The IDF, for its part, has been working day and night to demolish as much of the Hamas tunnel network running under the areas under its control east of the yellow line before Phase B compels them to pull back from those areas. Now, my understanding is we have already accomplished destroying about 50% of those tunnels. It was known as the Metro, with over 400 miles of tunnels dug out through under the whole of the Gaza Strip. It must be destroyed. Phase B also includes other things that are problematic for both Hamas and Israel, including the deployment of a so-called international stabilization force, which is supposed to take over physical control of the Gaza Strip and essentially be the police force for an interim administration of Palestinian technocrats assisted by an international group which has the somewhat Orwellian name, the Peace Committee, which President Trump is supposed to be giving leadership to, with on-the-ground administration being conducted by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. The Palestinian Authority is also supposed to be taking part in this effort in ways that are not entirely clear, and in any case, the Israeli government led by Netanyahu says it doesn't want that. The PA can't even manage the areas of Judea and Samaria it's already supposed to be holding administrative control over, and the PA police are outmatched by the Iranian-backed terrorist groups and heavily armed criminal gangs that have sprouted up there in recent years. The IDF, the Border Police, and the Shin Bet are carrying out regular security operations in the PA-administered areas to try and keep that problem under control. And in fact, some in the security establishment are saying that this is the big untold story of this war. Please be in urgent prayer for the security situation in Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel, because candidly, that's the area with the greatest potential to explode at the moment. Imagine something like that, what might happen as did on October 7th, happening in Jerusalem. Those are the things that security officials are warning about. And I can also tell you from my own personal observation that in some neighborhoods of Jerusalem, there are already increased tensions. Arabs and Jews live right next to each other in Israel's capital city, in case no one ever told you that, and we get along most of the time. But for all kinds of reasons, right now is not most of the time. So again, please be in prayer for the peace of Jerusalem. My grandchildren live here, along with many other members of my family and many other friends, so I'd consider it a personal favor. Thank you. Now, getting back on the ranch to Gaza, the proposal to go to Phase B of the ceasefire plan took a couple of hits this past week because it's becoming more and more apparent that there is no one willing to contribute serious numbers of troops to this force except Turkey, which is a non-starter for Israel. Turkey's government does not hide the fact that it is part of the International Muslim Brotherhood Alliance, which Hamas is also part of. They would be very unlikely to confront Hamas to try and force them to disarm, let alone that they're hiding Hamas members up in Turkey. Only 2 other countries have said they'd be willing to contribute soldiers to this force, Indonesia and Azerbaijan. These would be much easier for Israel to accept, but both countries have waffled in their commitments in recent weeks as the process has dragged on. Also, the money that is meant to pay for all this was supposed to come from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. But there's a big question mark over all that right now as well. Finally, a blow was struck to the American plans for Gaza this last week when Yasser Abu Shabab, the leader of one of the few armed groups in the Strip which were willing to stand up to Hamas and possibly take over some of the governance of the Strip after it is removed, lost his life. There are conflicting reports about exactly what happened, with some reports saying it was an internal clan turf war and other reports saying Hamas had him taken out. But either way, he's out of the picture. His deputy was immediately named as the group's new leader, and they said they'd carry on as before, but at this point, it's not clear how effective they can really be going forward. There have been other clashes between the IDF and Hamas in Gaza over the past week, resulting in casualties on both sides. As ceasefires go, this one seems to be pretty hot, and IDF leaders make no secret of the fact that they expect it to fall apart at some point, and they'll have to order their troops back into battle to finish off Hamas. If they do, it'll be easier for them to work without having to worry about Israeli hostages, but they'll also be under a great deal of political pressure. Israel's critics around the world, of which we have many, have not let up one bit since the ceasefire, and anti-Semitism is still running hot over the world and over the coals. Furthermore, there are already voices warning that President Trump, who won't be in the picture forever, might be the last U.S. president to give Israel full support. That would be a shame. There certainly are a growing chorus of voices, even in the conservative movement, who are very critical of Israel, sometimes for some very bizarre reasons. I don't want to get into that right now, but these voices that are critical of Israel also seem to be very harsh in their criticism of Christians who support Israel. I believe this is a spiritual issue, and the only way to address it is through intercessory prayer. So I'm asking you to join me in praying for these people, who we agree with on many social and cultural and conservative issues. I'll say no more about that for now, because I'm afraid we're still not done talking about the kinetic threats to Israel, especially in regards to the northern border. Now, Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed Shiite terror militia, which got hammered pretty hard in a short and decisive war with Israel about a year ago, from about the middle of September to the end of November 2024, hasn't had enough. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is doing everything they can to smuggle money, weapons, narcotics, ammunition, and equipment to them so they can have another go at Israel in the near future. Now, the internationally recognized government of Lebanon, you've heard me say this before, and the Lebanese National Army, which was supposed to disarm Hezbollah, have not moved aggressively to do so. And no one seriously believes they will at this point. The IDF has been hitting Hezbollah almost daily for the past several months, using airstrikes to take out senior field operatives and leaders, arms caches, smuggling routes, and other strategic targets. This has not stopped them one bit from replacing at least one-third and perhaps as much as half of the rockets, missiles, and UAVs they lost in the war a year ago. Don't these guys ever learn a lesson? Well, they have repeatedly threatened that they will resume firing these high-trajectory weapons into Israel when they reach the point where they think it would be most to their advantage. Threats to resume rocket and missile fire into Israel have also come from the Houthis in Yemen and from Iran itself. Now, Iran, which is suffering from a drought of biblical proportions, I'm getting thirsty thinking about it, an economy in utter ruins, rising levels of air pollution in its major cities, and many more internal problems, is still devoting most of its efforts and resources to threatening Israel. There are some intelligence estimates that they have managed to build or acquire enough ballistic missiles to bring their inventory back up to around 2,000 missiles, although they do not have many operational launchers yet, and there are also issues with supplying fuel for these missiles. Nevertheless, the intent is clear, and this war against Israel is far from over, friends. In fact, to switch briefly to commentary mode, I'm beginning to think it's going to just keep right on going, because it is at its heart a spiritual war. And the enemy leading this war against us knows his time is short. He's not saving anything for later, and so he's just going to keep this war in the natural going on as long as he can. This won't be like the wars Israel fought in the past in 1956, 1967, 70, 73, and 1982, when the violence flared up for a few days or months and then it was followed by years of relative calm. That's why, here at Vision for Israel, we are continuing to supply bomb safety shelters to protect Israeli communities from high-trajectory weapons, no matter who fires them or from what direction they come. We're also reinforcing medical first response teams, firefighters, community support teams, and even the police. So please watch this short video to see how you can help. October 7th, 2023, which was considered the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, security teams were devastated along the southern border of Israel. From October 8th onwards, also Hezbollah in Lebanon, a terror group, also attacked in the northern part of Israel. Security teams turned to Vision for Israel for extra aid and help, and many of the items that we provided were ceramic vests for security teams to avoid bullet wounds as well as shrapnel wounds. We also needed to provide proper helmets. Most of these security teams had outdated equipment that hadn't been replaced in decades. In addition to that, there was a request for medic bags and defibrillators and for all sorts of medical disposables that were needed. Then as a result of these rocket attacks, also fires were erupting, and so we were requested to provide firefighting equipment and generators and protective clothing in order to put out these fires. And so Vision for Israel is very happy to come alongside the civilian security teams, the community security teams. We even bought a new police vehicle for one of the southern cities and dedicated it together with the mayor. It was in the city of Sderot, which was badly hit during the first days of the war. And the requests keep coming in, and we will continue to keep providing. Welcome back, friends. Now we're continuing with the news, and I'm afraid I have to talk about something that might seem kind of boring, and it's not about Sufganiyot, but it's actually very important. I'm talking about the Israeli government's budget for 2026, which still has a few wrinkles to iron out, but which has essentially been finalized this week. Most of the details were published in the media. First, the big headline is simply this: the defense and security budgets are getting a massive increase, which is planned to continue for the next several years. This represents an incredible buildup of military power, and it's also likely that it represents a recognition by the political echelon that they're going to have to pay soldiers more going forward. There have been reports in the media lately indicating that far fewer young soldiers are choosing to make the military a career, and that has already led to a shortage of junior officers in the regular forces. There are many reasons for this, but one reason is that soldiers in Israel earn salaries that are substantially lower than what is available in the private sector. Now, that's a problem in many countries around the world that are trying to build up their military capacity. And although I haven't gone over the line items in this proposed military buildup here in Israel, I'd be surprised if that wasn't one of them. Another issue I'm hoping this large defense expenditure will cover is the need for the IDF to replenish stocks of ancillary equipment. Many years ago, I came home from my last stint of reserve duty and took off my combat boots for the last time. But my children did their own tours of duty in the IDF, and so I know that the shortages of boots and jackets and canteens and all kinds of other stuff has not improved since my time. In fact, when this war started following the October 7th massacre, one of the first issues that came up was the enormous numbers of reservists showing up to their bases and finding out that there wasn't enough gear for everyone. A lot of the gear that was available was old, fairly worn out, and in general not adequate. This went beyond sleeping bags that smelled like a high school gym class and beat up old mess kits. It also included body armor and helmets that didn't fit very well and probably wouldn't do much to protect the soldiers wearing them. Vision for Israel was among the many private organizations that urgently began raising money to buy the gear that security teams needed along the northern and southern borders. According to estimates, I've seen close to $50 million worth of donated gear was eventually provided before the IDF put a partial stop to these donations because they were so embarrassed by them, although some stuff continued to get sent in. Now, after over 2 years of work, quite a bit of the gear the IDF provided to the reservists, as well as this other gear that got donated, is worn out and needs to be replaced as well. So I'm sure that's where a lot of the money in this budget is going to. Another large item in this budget is going to be providing care and ongoing support for veterans of this war. This past week, the IDF published a report saying it is providing care for a staggering 82,000 IDF veterans who were wounded in this war, with most of those cases being for mental and emotional counseling. Physical wounds like getting hit by a bullet, shrapnel, etc. are far less common, but there are also a fair number of those kinds of wounds that the government is providing ongoing therapy and care for. This is going to cost a lot of money for a very long time, and we can add to that the cost that will be incurred by the economy for lost productivity and many other second-order effects. In any case, it's another thing to be praying for if you're someone who is concerned about Israel. And don't forget that scripture, "He that keepeth Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps, and neither do our reservists in Israel and the standing army." Now let's get into some of the other details which are emerging about the 2026 budget, which we need to be paying attention to. For starters, the budget adds up to 662 billion shekels, the largest in the history of modern Israel. That includes a rather large deficit of around 78 billion shekels, which will have to be financed by taking on additional government debt. Cuts to government services and salaries for government employees are also likely, as are tax increases. The value-added tax, which gets levied on almost everything, was already increased from 17 to 18%, and that increase is likely to stay in place. Many countries levy this tax on a variety of goods and services, by the way, but few states charge such a high rate. The bottom line, friends, is that the cost of living for ordinary Israelis is increasing along with the tax burden, and the government's budget for social welfare programs, education, healthcare, and much more are all going to decrease going forward. That means private nonprofits like Vision for Israel are going to be busier than ever before filling in the gaps, providing assistance to families and communities in distress, and in general doing everything we can to ease the burden and care for those in need. Over the last 2 years, I have said many times that we're busier than we've ever been before. And I've also said that many times that we're going to need your help for a very long time. So I hate being right all the time, especially about this, but this is also an opportunity for you to directly contribute to the care of God's chosen people in their hour of great need. So please watch this short video about some of the ways Vision for Israel is stepping up in this crisis and how you can be a part of it. And don't forget to go to our website, visionforisrael.com, and sign up for our free prayer newsletter. Welcome back, friends. Now, we're almost out of time for this week's report, so I'm just going to quickly go through some of the other stories that are making headlines in Israel this week. Byron, a named storm that already battered Greece and Cyprus, was set to arrive in Israel during this week, bringing strong winds and heavy precipitation. In fact, Byron was expected to dump nearly a year's worth of rain on the Galilee throughout the week. Now that's good news because last winter saw the lowest levels of precipitation in Israel since records began to be kept here in the middle of the 19th century. And so far, this winter has also been unusually dry and warm. Well, that's more good news because in northern Israel, rainfall has somewhere to go, which is the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. So flooding is unlikely there. And for all you that want to come to Israel on a tour trip and get immersed or baptized, we need water in the Jordan River, don't we? However, in other parts of the country, especially in the city of Haifa, there's a strong possibility of flooding and other damage. This is on top of the localized flooding which occurred last week in the Arava region of southern Israel, including in the Red Sea resort city of Eilat. So please join me in praying for Israel to quickly recover from this natural disaster which comes on top of so many other disasters recently. Now, I hate to bring up this next story, but we can't avoid it. Prompted by U.S. President Donald Trump, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has requested a pardon from Israeli President Isaac Herzog so he can dispense with his ongoing trial on charges of corruption and breach of trust. The Attorney General and a large segment of the public say that Herzog can't grant a pardon without an admission of guilt by Netanyahu, who has been testifying in court for several hours every week for months now. These testimony sessions are often canceled or delayed because of urgent state business, as I'm sure you can imagine. Furthermore, Netanyahu has long maintained that the entire process is motivated by politics. In other words, there's nothing to the allegations against him, but rather it's all a big show to try and damage him politically. On that note, he's also said he will not agree to retire from politics in exchange for a pardon. I have no idea where all this is going, friends, but please pray for Israel's government because there's a lot of stress on everyone right now. Finally, I want to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news. Yay! This week, the large Christmas tree in Bethlehem's Manger Square will be lit up for the first time since the Swords of Iron War began 2 years ago. Hopefully, this is the beginning of a return to tourism in the Palestinian-administered areas and Israel as well. Well, with that, I want to light the first candle of Hanukkah and say the prayer as we close out this program, because Yeshua is the light of the world, isn't he? Absolutely. And so the shamash, the middle candle, is the serving candle that helps all the others. And that I would have tipped over, but it's a bit oily, so I'll light it with a match. As that song goes, come on baby, light my fire. Sorry, I don't think that's what it was meant by it. But here's the prayer. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lahadlik ner Chanukah. Amen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, sha'asa nisim la'avotenu, bayamim hahem, bazman hazeh. Amen. And with that, I'm going to take a bite of my seasonal sufganiyot, a Hanukkah delight with jelly. Here we go. One for me. And one for you. Shalom, shalom.